I've been contemplating something for a while now. I've said this in a few different videos already, but occasionally bears can have really serious injuries but still keep running at you with determination and rage. Bear guide Ralph Young also makes the important point that bears are not the only creatures that can keep going for a while after taking significant amounts of fatal damage. Many other creatures like men and deer can also accomplish this. Mr. Young mentions one such encounter in his book. It involved a hunter named Joe and his guide shooting a 9.5-foot bear repeatedly as it continued to charge at them. They succeeded in destroying important organs like the heart and lungs, but failed to break any bones that would have actually physically incapacitated the bear. And just as Joe and his guide fired the last rounds in their rifles, that's when the bear decided to turn and run away. After making it roughly 70 yards away, the bear fell over and died. It's quite obvious that both men could have been seriously maimed or killed if the bear hadn't changed its mind. And it's situations like these that have brought me to the conclusion that the best way to quickly incapacitate a charging bear is to break both of its shoulders. Once it's incapacitated in this manner, you can shoot it in the brain to make sure that it's quite dead. Other people will say that you should shoot it in the head or spine first, and that would be appropriate in certain situations. However, it's fairly hard to make a headshot on a small moving target with the bear's head moving up and down as it runs. If you are willing to bet your life on your ability to make such a shot on a bear's small brain, especially with a handgun, I'd congratulate you because you're a better marksman than I am. So with rifles or shotguns loaded with good expanding rounds, it's not difficult at all to break a bear's shoulder. However, if we're talking about non-expanding handgun rounds, like hard-cast lead or full metal jackets, I have very little faith that such rounds would do enough damage to break a bear's large shoulder or leg bone with just a single round. I'll demonstrate this a bit with some pictures. The top two pictures are of a cow leg bone that was shot with regular soft lead, round-nosed .22 long rifle ammunition. The picture on the bottom demonstrates how much more damage a copper-plated hollow point round does to the same leg bone. Both of these rounds were shot from a rifle, not a handgun. We also have a couple of handgun rounds, a 9mm and a .45, both full metal jackets. They are not breaking or shattering the bone though. All they are really doing is making holes in the bone. Hard-cast lead rounds do essentially the same thing as well. The obvious question being, would it be better to use expanding handgun rounds of some type for bear defense? For black bears at least, we already know that the answer is yes, as long as you use the right ammunition and caliber. Author Richard Smith explains that he has used expanding rounds in Magnum handguns with good success while hunting black bears. He makes the important point that semi-jacketed hollow points sometimes expand too much and limit penetration. Jacketed soft points, on the other hand, won't do this. He goes on to say that calibers like 41 Magnum or 44 Magnum are suitable for bear hunting, stating that while you can kill a bear with a .357 Magnum, that does not make it a bear gun. He also says that you should not use a .45 Colt for black bear hunting because he knows of a case where the .45 Colt failed to have enough penetration to reach a black bear's vitals. I would add a bit of nuance to this and mention that both the .45 Colt and .357 Magnum are quite capable of quickly killing black bears. Just like with the .44 Magnum, when the ammunition you have expands too much, that's what's really preventing the round from reaching the vitals. From Foggy Mountain Guide Service, we have very similar recommendations for black bear hunting handguns. They say that any solid bullet, 40 caliber or more, that weighs 200 grams or more, going at over 1,000 feet per second is suitable for this. When they say solid bullet, they mean like a jacketed soft point, not a non-expanding bullet. They say that most jacketed hollow points are not good enough in calibers 41, 44, or 45 because they are lacking the penetration needed, and that you should instead use jacketed solid points that are made by Federal, Remington, Sierra, or similar companies. Or in the case that you are determined to use a cast lead bullet, that you should make sure to use one that is soft enough to deform and expand somewhat. Also, they mention that you can use hollow points and have good results, as long as the rounds you are using have limited expansion like jacketed soft points do. Finally, they mention a situation that Wayne Boskowitz encountered, where he emptied all the cylinders of his .357 Magnum into the chest of an angry black bear, with essentially no immediate reaction from the bear, and that was the reason that Wayne switched to a .41 Magnum instead. In my opinion, this is not a failure of the .357 Magnum. As mentioned before, when animals are sufficiently determined and angry, they fail to show much reaction to any bullet, regardless of the organ damage. More generally speaking, I'd say that it's common knowledge that expanding handgun rounds are better than non-expanding hard-cast lead rounds when you're using them specifically for hunting. Mark Hampton mentions that good expanding rounds, like the Partition and the Hornady XTP, are simply better on medium-sized game because they cause more damage and kill faster. I believe that these statements would also apply to similar limited expansion rounds like the Swift A-frame. Rounds like the Nosler Partition or the Swift A-frame have roughly the rear half of the bullet encased in copper, so that the bullet can only expand so much. This ensures good penetration. I want to be clear that Mark Hampton is talking about hunting in general, not about specifically shooting large angry bears. So if you have the right expanding ammunition and caliber, you can definitely use it for black bear defense. But what about the larger bears? Few people have the bravery and skill to hunt large dangerous game with just handguns, so we don't have a lot of data to answer this question directly. If we are generally talking about large game, expanding handgun rounds can definitely be effective. Todd Orr, for example, has used some sort of 240 grain expanding bullet for the 27 elk he has killed with his .44 Magnum. You may remember Todd Orr as the guy who survived 2 bear attacks in a row. He also made a pretty incorrect statement about how bear skulls are sloped so much that a ricochet is likely, and that you probably have to shoot a bear from the back of the head to get a brain shot. While bear skulls are quite sloped, ricochets are hardly common, and you can definitely put a bullet through the front of the skull and reach the brain. It's a common misconception that high skull thickness is why hard-cast lead rounds are so commonly used. In reality, the bone at a bear's forehead may only be about 1/8 of an inch thick. Hard-cast lead rounds are more or less what everybody uses now because penetration by itself is extremely important. These are some pictures of .357 Magnum Hornady FTX bullets that were shot into cattle skulls. These were older bulls that were specifically selected because the scientists wanted to test such rounds on animals that had larger and thicker skulls than other cattle. Every one of these pictures you can clearly see that the bullet entered the skull, fragmented in doing so, and did not exit the skull. So let's say you have expanding ammunition that fragments on impact with thick bone, and you are shooting at a charging bear. Rounds that hit thick bone, like the legs or shoulders, will probably shatter or break the bone itself. However, since the bullet is fragmenting, it will have very little penetration after going through that bone, meaning that those fragments are probably not going to inflict lethal damage to the heart or lungs because they probably aren't going that deep. How big of a problem is this though? Well, it greatly depends on where your rounds land. If all you accomplish is breaking one leg or shoulder and not inflicting any lethal damage, you're in for a very bad day, because all you've done now is only wound the bear and make it more angry. If your rounds hit less substantial bones like the ribs, or even pass between the ribs with the same type of sometimes fragmenting ammunition, it's much more likely that the rounds will make it into the heart and lungs and inflict fatal damage. But if they make it that far, that obviously depends on the bullet type and velocity and other factors. In case you're wondering, the picture on the left is of a polar bear skeleton, and the picture on the right is of an unusually festive grizzly skeleton. So we want to use rounds that will not fragment, but have some kind of expansion to better break bones, and we want to have good penetration and increased damage to flesh. As far as I can tell, jacketed soft points are the best for accomplishing these three things, and I'll elaborate a little why. Let's say we are comparing them to both regular hollow point rounds of some kind and extreme defense type Lehigh rounds. Let's talk about 10mm specifically. 115 grain Underwood extreme defense rounds do have a lot of penetration for a self-defense round, and they do significantly more damage to flesh than conventional hollow points do. It means that if you are not at all interested in breaking bone, this bullet or similar designs would be good. However, since they are solid copper and they don't expand at all, they do relatively limited damage to bone. So jacketed soft points are probably the best for this situation because of the following. They have rather limited expansion in flesh. The soft lead point readily deforms while striking hard objects like bone, causing more of a chance to break or shatter the bone. And finally, that they are generally more durable than hollow points because they are solid lead. A hollow cavity in the point of the bullet obviously weakens the bullet. A hollow cavity also makes expansion much more consistent. The deformation and expansion of a soft point is entirely reliant on the impact force and velocity of the round. Obviously though, I don't think anyone should really bet their life on hollow points being good enough for grizzlies, brown bears, or polar bears. As far as specific types of jacketed soft points, we have some limited data. This is not a particularly big problem because most jacketed soft points are very similar in construction. The 10mm Federal 180 grain trophy bonded round has roughly 16.7 inches of penetration and 10% gelatin. This is, in my opinion, rather disappointing and would be more what I'd expect from a hollow point round. The reason why the bullet acts this way is explained by revolver aficionado Sam in his video about their penetration in water jugs. Apparently they are constructed similar to standard hollow points, but they have their hollow point filled with more lead. So while they are technically jacketed soft points, they don't quite behave like conventional jacketed soft point rounds. In that same video, he found that 44 Magnum Winchester jacketed soft points have very good penetration. Hollow points tend to transfer more of their energy into bone than both extreme defense rounds and jacketed soft points, which is a double-edged sword because the standard pressure 9mm spear-jacketed hollow point failed to penetrate into the thick skull of a boar hog. Or jacketed hollow points may totally fragment when they hit bone, as mentioned before. I would also like to thank my subscribers and everyone who comments or shares useful tips about real-world results like this image. It's very helpful. I'd also like to say that people have demonstrated that at point-blank range, even a .177 caliber air rifle can penetrate through the thick bone of a hog's skull. So it's not actually a lack of energy that's the problem, it's how that energy is used that causes low penetration. Continuing with hollow point performance, we have examples like this one of a charging black bear shot and killed with a 10mm Hornady 180 grain XTP round. This was a follow-up on a bear that was wounded while bow hunting. The bullet itself was recovered and had high weight retention and almost passed completely through the bear. For some reason, this person and others in the forum took away the conclusion that the ammunition was lacking in some way. I obviously do not share this view because it succeeded in killing a charging bear with a single bullet. This person said that he found only one round in the bear and no sign that any of the other rounds he fired passed through the bear. Also, he referred to this bullet as being part of the critical defense line, which is incorrect but an easy mistake to make. So with the different species of bears, there is not only behavioral differences, but size differences as well. Generally speaking, grizzlies and brown bears are more aggressive than black bears, which really means that black bears are less inclined to attack you in the first place, and that it's less likely that black bears will get really enraged to the point that they start ignoring the bullets that you're putting in them. As for the size difference, when we start looking at penetration needed to get to the vitals across the species of bears, we find that on average there isn't that much of a difference. This information has been taken from a YouTuber's video about the subject. With brown and grizzly bears, we are generally talking about 4 or 5 inches needed to get into the chest cavity itself. We are obviously not talking about the real big behemoths that have extra fat. However, chances are that you are going to get attacked by an average bear and not an exceptional one. The depth of vitals part of the chart is how far the bullet can go before it runs out of vitals to damage. And when you look at those numbers, you have to remember that lungs have very little resistance and take up a lot of room. So 20 inches of 10% ballistics gel does not show the same resistance as 20 inches of bare vitals do. So, if you have a handgun bullet that is shot lengthwise through a bear that is charging at you, generally speaking, that bullet is not accomplishing much once it exits the vitals and starts damaging intestines and other things that aren't as important. However, there are a couple situations that you may need to penetrate through most of the bear. Probably the most common situation is when someone has wounded a bear during hunting, and the bear is running more or less directly away from you, so you are forced to shoot it through the rump and all the way into the vitals. This is the reason that bear guides use rifles and ammunition that have high penetration, because they want to make sure in this situation that the bear can be killed from this angle so that they don't have to go after a wounded bear. A much more rare situation is when the bear is attacking something or someone else and is facing directly away from you. The obvious problem here is that if you have a round that may penetrate entirely through the bear, you probably don't want to shoot the bear from that angle because you're probably going to end up injuring the person who's being mauled by the bear. Let's also go over an incident where handgun rounds repeatedly deflected off a bear's skull. Lewis Kiss was releasing a grizzly from its cage as part of a relocation effort. Lewis was on the cage in the back of a pickup. When the bear was released, it came back around, knocked the cage down, and began attacking Lewis. As the bear was biting Lewis's leg, he pulled out his .357 Magnum and shot the bear in the head 4 times. These rounds deflected off the head and ended up in the bear's hump. He missed with the 5th shot, but put the 6th shot right in the bear's spine, immediately ending the attack. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any verifiable information about the kind of ammunition that Lewis used, though. However, I want to say that, in my opinion, the chance of deflection or ricochet off a bear's forehead is only marginally increased if you use expanding rounds instead of hard-cast lead. The reason why this is because, generally speaking, deflection off the thin forehead bone only happens at extreme angles. At a less extreme angle, say 45 degrees, handguns with any reasonable amount of power still inflict enough damage on the bone to break through it. So at such extreme angles where deflection is more likely, it's actually the copper jacket of the bullet that's impacting the bone and not the exposed lead tip. Even if you have a thin copper jacket at that point, that leads to significantly more strength than just soft lead. Assuming, of course, that we're talking about a jacketed soft point. Now, if you're worried about a jacketed soft point flattening out on its side as it hits a bear's skull in this manner, I want you to think about how much force it takes to flatten out a bullet along its side. It would be pretty easy to do if you had a vise or if you had a heavy hammer and concrete underneath the bullet. Now, imagine if you have the side of a bullet pressing against the 1/8 inch of bone that consists of a bear's forehead. It doesn't take much consideration to realize that the bone will break before the bullet significantly deforms. If we are talking about deflection off of much thicker bone, especially after the bullet has expanded and lost much of its energy, the story may be a bit different. I would also say that very rounded or very pointed bullets are much more likely to deflect off of bone than flat-nosed bullets. Finally, I want to talk about the death of Jess Sethington. He disappeared into the woods one day, and no one ever saw him again. It was only years later that they figured out what had happened to him after a bear that became known as Old Groner was killed. You see, they had found .33 caliber jacketed rifle bullets and .38 caliber revolver rounds in the lower skull of this big tough old bear. These calibers matched the weapons that Jess Sethington used. So it didn't take much contemplation to realize that these old wounds inflicted on the bear were almost certainly caused by Jess, before Jess was promptly killed. Again, we don't know what kind of ammunition he had, but I thought that this story was interesting and worth mentioning. So in conclusion, you can use jacketed soft points for bear defense, but they are only available generally in calibers like .357 Magnum and .44 Magnum. The federal 10mm 180 grain load has less penetration than what you'd want for a bear round. So for a lot of people, hardcast lead or Lehigh defense rounds are going to be what people continue to use for bear defense. This is mostly due to the fact that people are generally moving towards semi-autos for bear defense, and away from revolvers and calibers like .44 and .357 Magnum that have suitable jacketed hollow points available.